Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, fins, flippers, and feathers, marine mammals and birds of Australia, presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Jacob Emerson. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. Over to you, Jacob.
All right, well, hello everybody. Hello from Australia. It's actually nice and bright and early here. We're living in the future on the 12th, not the 11th of December. But I'm really excited to present to you today about this topic, marine mammals and birds of Australia. My name is Jacob. I'm fairly new to NatHab. I have only started working with these guys in the last year. However, I've had a passion for the natural world for many, many years prior to that. And I've got a pretty in-depth understanding of a lot of the animals that I'm going to be introducing you to today, some very unique ones, some that are found only in Australia, nowhere else in the world. I have worked quite closely with a lot of these animals and their relatives in a zoological setting over the last couple of years before coming over to NatHab, but also pursued them in the wild, just with my own interests and, photographic ventures and things like that as well. So I've been lucky enough to see all of these species in the wild. I'm really excited to introduce them to you today because some of them are incredibly unique, very, very special species. So these are the main culprits that we are going to be having a look at today, although I will talk about a few others as well. And I want to start by saying these animals are ones you are quite likely to see or see signs of if you join us on a NatHab trip in Australia. There is no guarantee that you will see these animals. Some they may only be around during certain seasons. Some we may only see evidence of them, but not really have a chance to see the actual animal themselves. So one thing I want to discuss about all of them individually is where you are likely to see them. Some you may only see in the north, some you may only see in the south, but also the likelihood of seeing them as well, because we don't want to get all hung up on hoping we're going to see one of these particular animals when it actually may be quite a slim chance. So I'll definitely touch on that. I'm also going to be talking about the general biology of a few of these species, their history, and some of their conservation issues they're facing, as well as some of the successes they have had in regards to their conservation as well. I will also note that all photos, unless otherwise captioned, are actually my own photographs. Any that I've had to supplement, I have captioned with, of course, the photographer there. Now, here is a bit of a map of the southeast bottom corner of Australia. Australia, of course, is an incredibly big country. And we currently are running 3 tours, a northern itinerary, a southern itinerary, as well as an ultimate itinerary, which captures a little bit of both. Now, when we're talking about marine mammals, we're talking about animals that are adapted to the marine environment. And Australia is an island. So there's marine environment surrounding the entire country, more or less. And a lot of the places that we would visit on these trips are also smaller islands as well. So we'll start at the top. We've got Lady Elliot Island up the top in that little cluster with a few birds and the humpback whale-tail there. Go right down the bottom, you have the island state of Tasmania. And then we also spend time on an incredible place called Kangaroo Island as well. So all of these areas are surrounded by water. Up in the north there, if you keep heading out to the east, you're of course heading into the South Pacific Ocean, and of course gateway to the Great Barrier Reef. So Lady Elliot Island is an island found on the southern end of the reef and a very popular spot, particularly for seabirds to reproduce and nest, because they have, really good conditions for them to nest there, but also some of the migratory species like humpback whales will make their way up there to those nice, safe, secure, warm waters up in the northern parts of Australia. Then if we head down to the south, we have the Southern Ocean. Next stop is Antarctica if you head down there. And this location kind of is very productive and provides great resources for a huge number of marine mammals and birds in the food that they eat. So, the bottom of that food chain, or near the bottom, is, of course, the krill. It's thought there is the same amount of krill in the Southern Ocean in biomass as there is as people. So, up to 380 million tons. So this is basically an important food source for everything from the smallest little birds all the way up to the great whales. So you'll find a lot of marine mammals and birds down in these regions. Now, what is a marine mammal? So marine mammals are broken up into 5 main groups, 3 of which you will find in Australian waters. Those 3 are the pinnipeds, the cetaceans, and the sirens. We do not have manatees in Australia. We actually have an incredible animal known as the dugong. We aren't likely to see a dugong on any of the Nat Hab trips, but I thought I'd make an honourable mention for this animal. They're quite incredible. And then the other two groups which you will not find in Australia are the mustelids, which is the otters, and also today the polar bear. Now, marine mammals, they obviously have those adaptations of being mammals. You know, they produce milk, they have fur, and they're ectothermic and all the rest. But they also have a lot of other adaptations to survive in that marine environment. This can include things like very dense fur to help keep them warm, or a thick layer of blubber. They also have adaptations for being able to dive to very, very deep depths, store more oxygen in their blood, for example, and be able to survive and forage and hunt and thrive in great pressure or great darkness, with some of these animals being able to dive in excess of hundreds of meters or even over a kilometre below the surface when they're foraging, which is really quite incredible. There is over 50 documented species of marine mammal that have been seen in Australian waters. Now, marine birds, or more commonly known as seabirds, don't have as concrete a definition as the mammals. Of course, there was adaptations for being a bird, feathers, they lay eggs, etc. However, they have adapted more to a marine environment in their behaviour and their physiology. They do have the ability to actually drink the salt water and excrete excess salt. So this picture is a great example of a wandering albatross, which is one of the largest marine or seabirds. And you can see how he can excrete those the salt through those little tubes on the side of his beak there. But this group of animals can include animals like shearwaters, petrels, albatross, penguins, terns, boobies, a great number of different birds. They're often nomadic and migratory. And there's actually been over 200 species of seabird found in Australian waters. So now we're going to go into a little bit more depth with some of the main characters that you'll find here in Australia. The first one is the Australian sea lion, Neophoca cinerea, which translates to the new ash-coloured seal. Now, this is an Aussie battler with a lot going against it. I will start by saying this is one of the rarest sea lions in the world, numbering only around 12,000 individuals, which when you really think about it, isn't very many. And this species, unfortunately, has a lot going against them, which I will touch on a little bit more shortly. Now, the Australian sea lion is the only endemic species of sea lion that you will find in Australia, or the only endemic species of pinniped. So I might use the terms seal and sea lion a little bit interchangeably, which I know some people may not like that. But in Australia, we have the Australian sea lion, but we also have fur seals. Now, the fur seals are though more closely related to sea lions than the true seals. We often just call them seals down here. So just to get that out of the way to start. But the Australian sea lion is the only endemic species. So the other two species that breed in Australia will also breed in other countries around the world. And they do have quite a restricted range, mainly in South Australia and in Western Australia. About 85% of the Australian sea lions you will find in South Australia, and only about 15% in Western Australia. They did previously live down in the Bass Strait, down towards Tasmania as well, but they haven't been there for quite some time. And this species, as far as a sighting of being able to see these guys on one of the Nat Hab trips, you are very, very, very likely to see this species. We go down to a location on Kangaroo Island, which is very appropriately called Seal Bay. And it's one of the largest populations of Australian sea lions in the country. And here we take a guided tour down from boardwalks all the way down to the beach. So you're literally on the beach with these guys, watching them as they go about their daily sea lion business. And often you've got to kind of make way for the sea lions. They'll be resting at the bottom of the stairs, or you might have to find an alternative route to get down to the beach. But it's a fantastic spot. The sea lions just do their own thing. They're not worried about people whatsoever. And it also provides for some very great photographic opportunities, because there's always something going on. There's big males, there's big males defending their little harem of females. There's pups interacting, mums and pups interacting, naughty subadult males that are sparring with each other. There's always something going on. Plus, you have that beautiful Southern Ocean backdrop in the background, which is, just makes for some spectacular photos as well. Now, Australian sea lions, as well as all sea lion species, are what we call sexually dimorphic. Now, this basically means there is a marked difference between the males and the females, as you can see here. The difference can actually be more significant compared to what we're seeing in this photo. So on the darker animal with the golden cap there, that is the male Australian sea lion. Although this one isn't fully grown, he probably has a bit of growing yet to do. And the males can reach weights of around 250 to 300 kilos. So that's in excess of 600 pounds. Whereas the females, they're much paler in their coloration, and they only get to a maximum weight of around 100 kilos, often even a bit smaller than that actually, so around 220 pounds. So the males and females are very different in not just their size, but also their coloration. These guys are considered benthic feeders. That means they do forage for a majority of their food on the ocean floor. They aren't the deepest diving of pinnipeds, but they will head down to the ocean floor to eat a variety of different bottom-dwelling fish, as well as cephalopods, things like cuttlefish and squid, and also crustaceans. These guys aren't above grabbing a bit of crab or rock lobster for dinner as well. Now, one of the most incredible things about the Australian sea lion, which is one of the reasons they've got a bit going against them, is their reproductive cycle. So for a bit of context, all other sea lion species are pregnant. I'll put pregnant in inverted commas. I'll try to explain this as succinctly as I can. But they're pregnant for 12 months. But what actually happens is after they mate with a male, there'll be a delayed implantation where that embryo won't grow for 3 months. And then the true pregnancy where that embryo is growing is about 9 months. So basically from when they mate to when they have their pup is 12 months apart. And most species have the ability to actually have pups every single year. Now, the Australian sea lion throws this out the window. They are the only species that has an asynchronous breeding cycle. And they are basically in this, again, in inverted commas, pregnant stage for around 17.6 months on average. So about a year and a half, which is much longer than any other pinniped species. Additionally to this, they look after their pups for much longer, up to 18 months as well. So an Australian sea lion, rather than being able to have a pup every single year, may not have a pup, may only have one pup every 2.5 to 3 years. So for a species that is threatened, that is quite a slow reproductive output with not a whole lot of growth. And another thing that happens with these guys is the females have site fidelity. They stay in the beach where they were born. The males will actually cross in between beaches. There's a little bit of gene flow there. But as far as the females go, there isn't a whole lot of gene flow between beaches and populations. So this slow reproductive output meant that it's been quite slow going for these guys to recover in their population. So these guys, as I mentioned, they are endangered. They do have around 12,000 individuals left. And in the last 40 years, there has been about a 60% decline of this species. The one thing that impacted them during the 19th and 20th century was hunting or sealing for their fur, for their oil, leather, and their meat. And this species hasn't really bounced back as well as some of the other species that we might look at in regards to their population. But the things that are impacting them nowadays are things like gill nets, so from the commercial fishing industry, entanglement in marine debris as well. You can swim with these guys in Australia in certain locations. And as you can see, they're all having a little bit of a look at me under the water there. They're very curious. They're very playful. And if they often find a bit of rope or a bit of fishing gear underneath the water, it isn't uncommon for them to play with that, accidentally ingest it or get entangled in that as well. Another thing that they're quite prone to, unfortunately, in certain locations is different parasites, particularly hookworm in the pups, which can have quite a high mortality as well. So the combination of these things, as well as their slow reproductive cycle, has got quite a lot going against the Australian sea lion. However, there's some really good conservation going on for these guys. In fact, in October just gone, the South Australian government did implement an Australian sea lion national recovery plan with around 400,000 Australian dollars going towards research and protection of the Australian sea lion, which is fantastic. And another measure that was implemented a few years ago, which has had tremendous success, is exclusion zones for fishing vessels around areas where the pups are being born. Now, this was implemented in 2010. And prior to 2010, there was in excess of 200 animals getting caught in these gill nets every single year. So that's quite a lot when you've already got a highly endangered population. But since implementing this controlled exclusion zones in 2010, there's been a 98% decrease of bycatch of Australian sea lions, which is absolutely fantastic. And they are adopting this method in Western Australia as well, but they haven't done the population study and population census to see how it is impacting the populations in WA, but hopefully just as well as the ones in South Australia. And another thing that is being done with these animals that are susceptible to hookworm is scientists are actually going out and popping ivermectin, administering ivermectin to these young pups, which has proven to be very, very successful in getting rid of that hookworm. And there's less mortality in these regions where they're implementing this as well. So really, really cool, and some good work being done with our beautiful Australian sea lions. So the next one today, guys, is another pinniped species known as the long-nosed fur seal. This is another, I will often call them seals because of that name, but they do belong to the Otaridae family, the eared seals, so same as sea lions. And this one was formerly known as the New Zealand fur seal. However, in recent years, there is just as many New Zealand fur seals in Australia as there is in New Zealand. These guys have got very healthy populations in NZ as well. So in 2014, they did actually change the name for the Australian ones to the long-nosed fur seal. We do already have an Australian fur seal, so they couldn't just change it to that. And although there are some genetic differences between the populations in Australia and the ones in New Zealand, they are classified as the same species. Now, these guys we are most likely to see, very highly likely to see if you visit the western coast of Kangaroo Island on the southern or alternate itineraries. These guys like to climb up on the rocks and the cliffs, and that's where they prefer to rest and haul out, compared to the sea lions, which prefer to be on the beach. Again, there's a series of walkways that will take you down, and there's some quite good viewing locations for these animals. And even at this time of year, actually, we're about to start pupping season. So they're all about to start having their pups in a synchronized manner. There'll be lots of pups born down there. So over the next few months, if you are visiting Australia on any of these itineraries, it's a really good time to actually see these guys down there as the pups are starting to find their way in the world. Now, just like the Australian sea lion, they are sexually dimorphic. So the males can get up to around 200 kilos and the females only to about 50 kilos. So you can see the big male there with the big barrel chest. The males will actually put on a significant amount of weight coming into breeding season. So you can see individuals that maybe at certain times of year, their average weight might only be 120 kilos, and they can get to 200 kilos in a matter of months to prepare for breeding season and be able to, defend against other males, be very imposing against other males and things like that. So quite an impressive bulking season for these long-nosed fur seals. And in Australia, they do have a fairly similar range to the Australian sea lions. So the biggest populations you will find in South Australia. But unlike the Australian sea lion, these guys are dispersing quite rapidly into new locations. So into Western Australia, into Victoria, down into Tasmania, and even up into New South Wales. The location where I live, a place called the Central Coast of Australia, just north of Sydney, is even starting to see some breeding populations of long-nosed fur seals, which if you go back 10 years, wouldn't have been the case. You will also find these guys in New Zealand, of course, and down on a few of the subantarctic islands. They are a very deep diving species. They're not as specific in their food habits as the Australian sea lions. And the males of this species have been known to dive to depths of about 380 meters below the surface and hold their breath for around 15 minutes. So 380 meters, that would be well in excess of 1,000 feet. Probably more than that. Sorry, I'm not great with my meters to feet conversions, being from Australia, but they can dive pretty far down to look for their preferred food sources. So pretty incredible. Now, these guys, of course, are known as fur seals because they have that beautiful fur that you can see. You may see on this little pup here, especially up towards his head, and down on the body as well, that you can see there's two distinct layers of fur. There's the dark overcoat and then a very fluffy undercoat. And these guys actually have the second densest fur of any mammal. The only one that has denser fur than them is the sea otter. So this is what helps these guys to stay nice and warm, but it was also highly prized by sealers and hunters during the 19th and early 20th century as well. And this species was the preferred target, and they did almost get hunted into extinction as well. However, once that sealing stopped, the population has grown up very, very nicely. There's over 100,000 individuals in South Australia alone, let alone in the other states. The population has increased so greatly, in fact, that some very vocal politicians are even calling for a cull of the long-nosed fur seals because they do sometimes impact fishing and fish farms and tuna farms and things like that. The South Australian government has had a firm stance that there will be no culling of long-nosed fur seals. But it is certainly good that number has increased so rapidly and these guys aren't threatened anymore. Now, this map here is an incredible map of a long-nosed fur seal that I was actually fortunate enough to work with in a rehabilitation sense. So occasionally you will see long-nosed fur seals further north in their natural range. And this individual, his name was Skip. was a 1.5-year-old individual that was found up near Fraser Island in Queensland in subtropical waters, so very, very long way away from home. Skip did have a few cookie cutter shark bites on his body, as well as being highly emaciated, whereas Skip should have been weighing about 18 kilos, only weighed about 10 kilos, so very, very skinny. So this animal did come into care for a period of time for rehabilitation. I was lucky enough to work with this individual during rehabilitation, and then in December of 2022 was released. Basically, Skip got flown down to Sydney and released out of Sydney Harbour there, which is where you can see that first little red marker. And between December 2022 and August 2023, which is when we lost the tracker, or the tracker would naturally fell off of Skip, you can see how much land and how much ground Skip covered. So all the way down to the island state of Tasmania, down into the Southern Ocean twice, and then finishing up on the west coast of Tasmania there. Now, this is one of 4 individual fur seals that have been tracked in this manner now, from a new initiative from the Australian government known as the Seabirds to Seascapes initiative. 2 of the individuals have hung around the release site somewhat. Skip obviously went on this massive voyage down to Tasmania, and the most recent individual was only actually released a little over 2 weeks ago, so yet to kind of see what the patterns are for that one yet. But this provides really important information on these incredible animals and what they are doing with this satellite tracking, which is really cool. Now we'll move along to the first bird on the list, and I will admit the Australian pelican is cheating a little bit. Some may argue it is not technically a seabird or a marine bird. These guys can survive quite comfortably in freshwater environments as well as marine environments, but I had to include them because they are a quintessential part of our Australian coastlines. They're a very underrated bird, in my opinion. They are just so big and so beautiful and charismatic, and you will see these guys around basically all of our Australian coastlines. Where we are most likely to see them on Australian NatHab trips is on Kangaroo Island down near the American River, which is where the accommodation actually is. So if you just basically go straight down to the water, you're quite likely to see these beautiful Australian pelicans, but very routinely you will see them flying overhead as well. You can see this picture here. He's surrounded by a bunch of other smaller seabirds. You can get an idea of the size when he's compared next to some darters and cormorants and terns. They are very, very big. They can weigh between 7 and 10 kilos with a wingspan of 2.5 meters. So quite a significant wingspan there. So that's a wingspan of, I think, 7 to 8 feet. And they can weigh up to, 22 pounds. So really quite big. They need a lot of lift to be able to get in the air because they are so heavy. So after they do a few big flaps, they will try and just get on the wind and basically just soar around using as little flapping as possible. And they have actually seen these guys as high as 3,000 meters above sea level gliding up there, which is pretty incredible. Now, as far as the feeding habits of the Australian pelican, this is a classic example of it. They have an inbuilt fishing net, which is actually known as a pouch. Now, this pouch can hold up to 7 litres of water, and they basically use it and they plunge into the water to grab their preferred food. Now, preferred food for a pelican can vary from the little bait fish, like you can see this one hunting in the picture here. I've also seen pelicans swallow a mullet, which is about 12 inches long. So they're not necessarily fussy whether they're going for the big fish or small fish. They are fairly opportunistic, and they'll eat just about anything that can fit in their mouth. They've also been known to, even eat small birds and bird chicks, turtles, all sorts of things like that. So they're not particularly fussy, but they will use this big pouch to plunge into the water to grab their preferred food. Now, when it comes to breeding of Australian pelicans, this is where things get very interesting. Anywhere on the coastline, more or less, you will find Australian pelicans here in Australia, a fairly common species. However, they don't often breed on these coastlines. They will breed in inshore lakes. However, these lakes in Australia, they're kind of boom and bust. They're not always full. So after big, heavy rains, they will often fill. A classic example is one called Lake Eyre. And this one only fills every 10 to 20 years. So not very often. However, when these inland lakes do fill up, the pelicans know, and they will migrate en masse to these locations to partner up, reproduce, lay eggs, and raise their chicks. They will occasionally breed on the coastlines, but nothing like what you see here. You will only see these massive congregations of pelicans on these inland lakes every 10 to 20 years. Highly variable. So really, really interesting that they instinctively know to move to these lakes to breed. Of course, the water coming in makes more vegetation, which is more food for fish and for prey. So it just makes, obviously, an ideal situation for these guys to reproduce. Now, little pelicans, baby pelicans, I should say. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Here's a little baby pelican here. These guys can lay up to 3 eggs, but quite often it is only a single chick that will survive. They are very, very competitive. So if there is a chick that's a bit bigger, normally the eldest chick, it will often outcompete its siblings for food. And their parents will look after them for about 4 months, and then they will join a creche. Again, similar like what you can see in this picture on the right-hand side there. You can see some pelicans at different ages there. And they'll basically go in that creche. The parents will spend less time coming back to feed them, and eventually they'll take to the sky and have to fend for themselves. Now, this next picture is a little bit confronting, but it is one of the main issues that is facing pelicans and a lot of seabirds here in Australia, which is run-ins with fishermen in the form of fishing line, lures, hooks, all sorts of fishing equipment, which can damage these guys quite significantly. This is an X-ray taken by Australian Seabird Rescue, and unfortunately we do see this kind of thing quite often where pelicans will ingest fishing gear, fishing hooks, or simply just get entangled, hooks through their wings or their legs or their bills, all sorts of kind of horrible injuries. So the pelicans aren't above trying to get an easy feed from fishermen, but a good start is just for fishermen to be more aware. There's some really good signage popping around in several coastal locations, as well as specialised bins for your fishing line and hooks and your gear to be disposed of safely. So hopefully we see less of this kind of entanglement with these animals. And the next critter on the list is a very small and unassuming bird. We're going from one of the biggest birds to one of the smallest. This is the short-tailed shearwater. This guy only weighs around 500 grams, so around 1 pound, if my conversions are correct. And this is a species that we are quite likely to see on the southern itinerary on a location on the Great Ocean Road. So we visit a place on the Great Ocean Road known as Lockhart Gorge, and there is an island just not even probably 100 meters, probably closer than that actually, off the coast there on a lookout point. I think it's called Shearwater Island, and it's an island where shearwaters will return as the sun is setting to return to their nests. So basically you'll be out there watching a beautiful sunset, and then all these little black dots will come out of the sky, start spiraling down and landing on that island. Up to 12,000 birds, so quite a large population. However, there are some islands in Tasmania that number in the millions, and the overall population of the species is over 23 million. So not on the threatened species list as it currently stands, but what makes these guys so incredible is their migration. They undergo one of the longest migrations of any bird in the world, 16,000 kilometers each direction. So in September, they will leave the Bering Sea up near Alaska. They'll come down through the Pacific Ocean before arriving in Australia in around November. So a very, very long way to go. And they come down to Australia to breed and to reproduce. They'll spend their time here, obviously making their nests, reestablishing old bonds with their partner, laying their eggs, laying their single egg, I should say, raising up their chicks before returning on that migration in around April, heading right up past Japan there before returning to the Bering Sea again. So absolutely incredible migration. Other shearwater species do undertake these migrations as well. However, this one from the short-tailed shearwater is absolutely incredible. And the reason they are migrating is to reproduce. Here's a cute, fluffy little shearwater chick. These guys will pair up when they first arrive, often with the same partner, because they'll go to the same burrow that they have previously bred in. They'll pair up and they'll actually prepare their nest, and then they'll go out for a couple of weeks and start foraging. The parents need to put on significant weight, because when they are looking after those eggs, they could be sitting on that egg for 2 weeks at a time, not being able to eat a single thing. So the parents will go out and forage before laying the egg, one egg. And once that egg hatches, they of course have to start feeding their little chickie. Now the chick can get to a weight of 1 kilo, twice as heavy as its parents. They turn into these big fat blobs, which is really, really important because the chicks need to have this excess weight to be able to migrate. They don't migrate with their parents. Basically, once these chicks get up to a good weight, the parents will leave. They'll leave it, they'll go off on their migration, and the chicks will spend a bit of time losing that feather down, growing their flight feathers, building up their flight muscles, and then when a strong westerly wind comes through, the chicks will undertake this migration instinctually on their own, perhaps with a few other birds that aren't reproductive yet, so maybe, a few that are, 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, but they'll basically instinctively take on this migration, which is really quite incredible. Now, when they're at this size as well, an interesting thing regarding the short-tailed shearwater is they are one of Australia's only native birds that are harvested by Indigenous people. So the Indigenous Australians will harvest these guys for feathers, flesh, and their oil. This is a harvesting custom that has been going on for over 8,000 years, so very ingrained in Indigenous culture, particularly down in Tasmania. However, nowadays, although this does still take place, this is very, very strictly regulated by the government to make sure there isn't an over-harvesting of these animals. So quite an interesting situation that you don't see with a lot of Australian native birds. Now, this is another confronting photo, guys. I'm sure we've all seen something along these lines before. Apologies to just whip it up on the page there, but one of the biggest things that is impacting seabirds is plastic ingestion. There is fairly recent evidence that the smell of plastic breaking up on the surface of the water in the sun emits a similar smell to the smell that is made by krill consuming phytoplankton. So you're kind of wondering, how can this bird end up with so much plastic in his stomach? Seabirds, compared to a lot of other bird species, do have quite a good sense of smell. So it could just be completely by accident that they're getting this sense of smell and scooping up this plastic, which of course can eventually cause to death and malnutrition, all sorts of other issues of not just the adult bird, but also the chicks as well. These guys are also quite a victim for the gill nets, like I previously mentioned with the Australian sea lions, with about 50,000 birds succumbing annually to that. However, as it stands, with 22 million individuals, they are not threatened, although there is some work being done to try and mitigate these things, of course. There is an agreement between Australia and New Zealand, Australia and Japan, I should say, a migratory bird agreement that is working to minimise the effects of fishing vessels on these birds when they are participating in that migration. And a cool little conservation success story as well, guys, is actually, a cool conservation success story that is actually occurring is, lost my train of thought, is in a place called Phillip Island, So Phillip Island is in Victoria, in the southern part of Australia, and there's a large population of shearwaters that do breed there. And when it's time for the chicks to start their migration, there's a Facebook page with the entire community on it. And when this is time for these chicks to start migrating, they'll actually turn all their lights out on businesses, houses, even select street lights as well, because this can distract these birds undergoing their first migration. They will use the moon and the stars to help navigate themselves. And if they get confused by all these lights, they'll often end up on roads and in people's backyards and things like that. So a community initiative to help these shearwaters, they'll see when they're starting to migrate. Everyone will go on the Facebook group, shut their lights off for the next couple of days to ensure that it's a nice, easy start of the migration for these birds, which is really cool. Now, the next individual I'm going to introduce you to is probably my favorite animal on this list. It is the little penguin, the smallest species of penguin in the entire world. They do have a few different names, the little penguin, the fairy penguin, or the blue penguin. You can see that beautiful blue coloration on this individual here. And these guys are the only species to breed on the Australian mainland. So you will find them in New Zealand as well, but you won't find any other penguins nesting here in Australia. Now, this is the species that we are least likely to see as far as seeing the actual animal on this trip. We would have to be very, very, very lucky. And you probably need a very good set of binoculars or a very, very long lens. This here is a view of the Great Ocean Road, the 12 Apostles. And you can see down on the beach there all these little tracks. Those aren't footprints from humans. Those are footprints from little penguins. So basically, guys, these guys are very, very timid and shy. Once the sun goes down and it is dark, they'll emerge from their day foraging out of the ocean, come up the beach and into the vegetation where their chicks will be, or just to shelter and rest. And then before the sun comes up again, they'll head out back to the ocean. So amongst all this dune vegetation, there is a series of nests where these guys are breeding. And that is the only real likelihood of seeing them, unless you have a really random bird that wants to pop out during the day. But if we did on the last trip with a very, very long lens and some binoculars see just a little head sticking out of one of the burrows, you're probably more likely to see them, I suppose, when they are molting and they're not entering the water at this time, or when they have chicks and those chicks are starting to emerge and get a little bit more confident about the world emerging from the burrows. But it certainly will not be a close-up encounter. But it is really cool that you can still see the evidence of these guys. You can see their habitat where they like to nest, as well as all these little foot tracks. There is evidence that they are definitely around. Now, when I talk about molting, penguins molt their feathers very, very differently. You might think this penguin that we're looking at right now is sick or there's something wrong with him. He's absolutely fine. He's just going through a process called catastrophic molt. And this process is basically by which the penguins will molt all of their feathers over a 2-week period. If a bird of flight molted all his feathers at the same time, he wouldn't be able to fly. But penguins don't have this problem. So they'll molt over this 2-week period. But as you can see, he's not going to be able to stay warm very easily out in the water. He's very fluffy. He's very buoyant. He's not very aquadynamic, I suppose. He's not going to be swimming very fast. So during this time, they will actually stay out of the water for 2 weeks. And as a result, because they're out of the water for 2 weeks, they won't actually do any hunting. So they have to basically fast for 2 weeks at a time while they go through this process. And once they've got their beautiful, shiny new feathers, that's when they will head back out into the oceans to go foraging again. So these guys, one of the most amazing things about little penguins, I've been lucky enough to work alongside them for many years, is how much food they can actually consume. This 1 kilo little bird, this tiny, unassuming little penguin, can eat up to a quarter of their body weight in a single sitting. So these guys, they may not be lucky enough to find fish on every foraging trip they go out. So as a result, they have the ability to gorge themselves and eat a great deal of food. These guys do specialize in eating small schooling fish like pilchard sardines and anchovies, but they will also eat small squid and krill as well. They're very good divers. Their Latin name, or their scientific name, actually translates to good little diver. I'll spend a lot of time diving quite far beneath the surface looking for their preferred food. Now, one of the biggest threats for these guys is actually introduced predators. So introduced predators, things like foxes are one big one. An initiative that actually has taken place in one location in Australia is using these Maremma sheepdogs, these guard dogs, to actually protect penguins on an island off the coast of Victoria. In the year 2000, there was around 500 individual penguins on this island, and in 5 years, that number decreased to only 10 individuals. So it got absolutely decimated by these foxes who would cross over to the island during the low tide. Now, they introduced the dogs, and the population did build up very, very nicely for a number of years. And the dogs basically just stay on the island during the breeding season. They'll keep the foxes away, but they also know to leave the penguins alone. So a really cool initiative. There's been a few speed bumps with this program over the last few years. However, on the whole, it is a really cool initiative. And these Maremma sheepdogs as well, guys, are actually being used to protect a number of different Australian native species too. Bandicoots and other small marsupials as well, which is really, really cool. They can be used in this capacity. Now, going from one of the smallest to one of the biggest animals, of course, we have the humpback whale. Now, I know there are humpback whales in the Northern Hemisphere as well, but we do see these guys undergo their annual migration here in Australia. Now, as far as sightings go, this is a seasonal sighting. So if you are on our Northern itinerary or our ultimate itinerary where you are visiting Lady Elliot Island, during September, October, and maybe into the start of November, you will hopefully see humpback whales. You can see them from the air as we're arriving by plane onto the island. You can see them from the beach or if you go out on any boats. But one of the most incredible things you can do is actually pop your head under the water while you're snorkeling, and you'll often hear these guys vocalizing and singing underneath the water, which is a very, very surreal thing. Now, the reason these guys do come up to Australia is to have their calves. Their feeding grounds are down in the Southern Ocean, the oceans and waters surrounding Antarctica. And they will then come up to either the east coast or the west coast. This is the orange arrows here that you can see, to come up and have their calves in the warmer and safer waters. Another species of southern right whale does follow a similar pattern, although they don't really come up the sides of Australia. They tend to stay just beneath the south coast there. But it's really important for them to do this because if they had their calves down in Antarctica before they built up a sufficient blubber layer, it would simply be too cold and those calves would freeze. So that is the reason they do come up north. Now, these whales are very iconic, very unique in their morphology. They've got those big, beautiful flippers, which are about 4 meters long, as well as the humpback, which is why they are named. And most of the time they are black on the top and white underneath, or at least our ones in the southern hemisphere are. But there is this individual floating around. His name is Migaloo. Now, Migaloo is a white whale, fully grown male white whale, who I've been lucky enough to see in person. There are a few white whales going around, but this is probably one of the most famous whales. It's not one of the most famous animals in Australia. He hasn't been seen the last few years on migration, so hopefully nothing has happened to him, but an absolutely incredible example of that humpback. As you can see, he's got it out of the water, and this is just a picture of him traveling with a normal coloured whale. Now, another confronting photo, we are talking about the threats that do face these species, guys, so they will pop up occasionally. This one is of a whale entangled up in a shark net. So whaling was the biggest threat to whales, of course, similar to the seals. They were harvested until near extinction. There was thought to only be around 500 individual humpback whales in Australia left in 1963 when they were protected. But they have had a massive increase of about 10% per year. And as it stands, the number is around 40,000. So a fantastic success story for the humpback whales. And a few of the things that are impacting or threatening them, guys, are things like, on a smaller scale, the shark control programs on the east coast of Australia. These shark nets are designed to capture sharks and provide a bit of a safety net for what people think when they go to the beach, that sharks aren't going to come in and grab them. It's not exactly how they work, but unfortunately, because these mother whales with their calves do try to stay quite close to the shore during their migration or when their calves are very young, we will often see them getting entangled in those and the calves as well. There are some specialised teams that are very, very good at removing the whales from these nets. I've been lucky enough to be out on a few of those boats myself. They do a fantastic job, but it is something that is ongoing. The governments at this point are unwilling to remove those nets during the migration season. But another thing that has the potential to impact these whales is their food sources being impacted through two main means. One is overfishing, over-harvesting of krill down in Antarctica. But also climate change impacting the behaviour patterns of the krill, which means these guys have to kind of change their patterns to be able to find enough food as well. So there's a lot of research going on how climate change is going to impact whales, with more research certainly on the way regarding this. And there are certain cases which haven't been seen historically and more recently where whales are starting to forage in Australian waters as well on their migration back south. Now, whether this is, we don't know exactly why this is, but this is a fairly new thing that we are seeing with the humpback whales on their migration. And one of the greatest bits of conservation or ecotourism as well for humpback whales is whale watching, with around $2 billion US dollars going into the economy every single year in regards to whale watching. It's a great medium for people to learn about these incredible animals. So as far as conservation success, we have seen the numbers of humpback whales in Australia increase, which is fantastic, but also many people have the opportunity to learn and donate and aid, in the research of these whales as well, with often researchers utilising these boats for their studies of observing the whales and things like that too. So a good success story for these guys. Now, the next two animals, guys, I'm going to fly through these ones fairly quickly in a bit less detail than our other ones. There's some of the seabirds of Lady Elliot Island. Now, there's over 159 species that have been recorded on Lady Elliot Island. This is the island on the southern end of the Great Barrier Reef, which is pretty impressive for such a small island, only 110 acres in size. The island actually and the birds, the birds basically were the architects of helping to build this island. There was a coral spit, and over several years, the guano and the feces from the birds combining with the sediment built the island up into what it is today. Additionally to that, because all that nutrients went into the ground and provided soil, there's a great deal of vegetation on the island as well. So basically, the birds were the architects of building Lady Elliot Island, which is really quite cool. But the two species we're going to talk about today briefly are the black noddy tern and the red-tailed tropic bird. Now, the black noddy is named as, during its courtship process, it nods its little head, so a very appropriate name for these guys. They're a highly monogamous species with up to 86% of them partnering for life. And one of the most interesting things is they are the only bird on Lady Elliot Island that will breed and lay their eggs in trees. All the other species will lay their eggs and have their nests on the ground. The black noddy is one of the smaller species, so perhaps to just avoid competition, it eventually took to the trees. And that has benefits. It doesn't have to compete with any other birds, but it also has disadvantages as well. And one of them is the relationship it has with the Pisonia tree. Now, the Pisonia tree, guys, is one of the only trees on the island and is where the birds do nest. Now, occasionally they may get a few seeds stuck to them from this very sticky seeds that do form on this tree. And they can take those to other places for, the seeds to propagate and expand the range of the Pisonia tree. However, certain individuals like this fella here can get inundated with seeds and get them all over his body, over his wings, to the point where they can no longer fly. If they can't fly, they can't go out and forage. And often these birds that have got all these seeds on them will die of starvation, often near the home tree where they were first entrapped. And that provides nutrients for the tree. So quite an interesting relationship between these guys. The birds obviously need them to nest, but also they can succumb to some pretty grisly way to die, I will say. Death by tree, death by seeds of the tree. which does happen quite routinely on the island. And another species, guys, one of the more charismatic ones on the island is the red-tailed tropic bird. Lady Elliot Island is one of only 2 places where this species will breed. And I just wanted to note this species in particular because there's a fantastic banding and satellite tracking project going on with the University of the Sunshine Coast, where they'll pop tags on these birds and see where they're going out to forage when they're not more restricted to the island for breeding. You can see the cute white fluffy chick next to mum there, which mum or dad, actually, I couldn't tell you if that is mum or dad. So these guys will nest on the ground. And they are designed for a pelagic life. So you may have noticed in that first picture, they have very, very, very small feet and small legs. So when they're on the ground, they don't really walk. They kind of use their wings to crawl along the ground, which is quite interesting. Now, this kind of concludes the part, guys, where we are talking about animals we are likely to see on the NatHub trips. But I will also talk to you quickly about 2 animals that World Wildlife Fund is involved in with research and support as well. One of them here is the shy albatross. So the shy albatross is Australia's only endemic albatross species. They only breed on a handful of islands off the coast of Tasmania. And these guys are particularly susceptible to population decline. They are classified as vulnerable. They breed very, very slowly. But they're also very uninclined to try and find new islands to nest on, even though there has been a bit of degradation on the islands where they are currently nesting. So things like reduced vegetation to build their nest and things like that. There also has been quite a high level of mortality in the last few years due to warmer temperatures and increased rainfall, which impacts the ability of the chicks to survive as well. However, WWF is working with the Tasmanian government and the Tasmanian Albatross Fund to help research and protect this species, which is fantastic. And the main form that they're doing that is they are actually popping artificial nests on the island to provide more nesting locations for these birds. Albatross are really big birds, guys. You can get an idea of that with the scientists here, how big these birds are. But they're popping these nests, which are made of mud, brick, and concrete. They're popped over 120 on Albatross Island, and they're being readily accepted by the birds. And they are providing a very ideal location for them to lay their eggs, incubate their eggs, and raise their chicks, which is really good. So I think it is yet to be researched whether this is impacting the population as a whole with more recruitment of chicks occurring. However, hopefully we'll see that in years to come. And they also are working to do satellite tracking of these birds. Once they leave their nest, they may not return to land for up to 5 years. They'll just be out on the Southern Ocean foraging. So it's really interesting to know, what are these birds doing? Where are they going? Are their patterns changing with the patterns of the fish and the krill and the squid and stuff changing over time? How are they being impacted by fishing vessels? Because these guys will often follow fishing vessels for an easy feed. So all this information is really quite important to know, and hopefully we can continue to gather that with satellite tracking in collaboration with WWF. And the last individual, guys, is the southern right whale. So the southern right whale is a species we have a very, very, very low chance of seeing on these trips. Not impossible, but incredibly low. You may see them off Kangaroo Island if there's a few stragglers that haven't returned back to Antarctica. And they're called the southern right whale because they're found in the south, but they were also the right whale to catch. They were very slow moving, spent a lot of time at the surface, so very, very easy for the whalers to be able to harvest these guys. And by the 1920s, there are only a few hundred individuals. Now, since whaling stopped, just like the humpbacks, the numbers have increased. There's around 3,500 now. So not increasing as quickly as the humpbacks, but certainly getting up there, which is really, really good. And WWF is collaborating with Murdoch University here in Australia to utilise drones to be able to get pictures and video of these whales and have a look at their body condition. So if the krill stocks continue to deplete or change, this can, of course, impact animals on all levels of the ecosystem. But if they're seeing whales return to Australia with less body condition previously, we can see that maybe they're not getting enough food. So by using these body condition scores, by utilising the drones, that's some important information we can gather on this incredible species. And with that, guys, thank you very much. I'm glad you were able to join today. I'm sorry I couldn't get my webcam working for this one, but I'm glad you were able to join me today and learn a little bit about some of the incredible Australian marine mammals and birds that you can find. And hopefully, if you do join us on an Australian trip, you'll be lucky enough to see some of these species yourself. So big smiles from an Australian sea lion to finish up. Thanks very much, guys.
All right, thank you, Jacob. Now, before we start with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. Okay, let's get to a couple of them now. So are there many animal species that are shared by both Australia and New Zealand, or does that not happen a lot?
Yeah, there certainly is. So the classic example is the long-nosed fur seal or the New Zealand fur seal, where you'll find them in both areas. But I think the thing with a lot of marine mammals and birds is they're highly nomadic. So you will often find these guys at least foraging in a lot of other areas. So the humpback whales will end up in New Zealand, or at least passing through New Zealand, as will the southern right whales. You will see off the coast of Tasmania a number of different albatross and shearwater species foraging off there, but they will often actually nest in New Zealand. So geographically, we are quite close. So there certainly is some crossover there of different species, or the same species, so I should say, that you will find in Australia and in New Zealand. But there also are the endemic ones that you'll only find in Australia, like the Australian sea lion. New Zealand has its own sea lion species called the Hooker's sea lion, as well as a few endemic dolphins over there as well. In Australia, we have 2 endemic dolphin species, the Australian humpback dolphin and the snubfin dolphin. And in New Zealand, I think they've got 1 or 2 species over there as well. So there certainly is, the potential for endemic species to be very localized to those countries, but there certainly is a lot of crossover with many species as well.
Great, thank you for addressing that. So when the whales get caught in the shark nets, how is it that they are released?
Yeah, so it's a very incredible work. I used to work with the team that went out. Unfortunately, although I love marine mammals and birds, I get seasick quite often, so I only went out of a few of those trips to help them. But basically what they'll do if the whale is entangled in a net is what they will try to do is actually attach really large floats and buoys to the net to basically try and encourage the whale to stay at the surface and not try and dive, particularly if it's a mobile whale that has broken the nets and he just keeps going on with his migration. If he dives, we can't do anything. So the idea is to keep the whale at the surface. So they'll attach these buoys to the net, encourage the whale to stay at the surface, and they use some specialized recurved knives that basically it's impossible to cut yourself with these knives, kind of like in a hook shape, and the sharp bits on the inside. So they'll basically try and hook the net and just cut away with these really sharp blades, cut away that shark net off the individual. Once they've got it all off, the whale will basically continue swimming and carry on with its migration. So highly successful. The teams that do this are very, very good at what they do. We are seeing it occur more often than ever, but I think that's just a correlation of there are more whales migrating more than ever. More whales is more likely they're going to get entangled and entrapped. A majority of the time, the whales are released unharmed and without issues. Occasionally, maybe a small calf has been known to drown in those nets, unfortunately. But the big discussion at the moment is talking with the Australian government, particularly the Queensland government, where this usually occurs, into whether we can remove these nets at certain times of year. Because it isn't just the whales that get impacted, it is turtles, dolphins, as well as sharks, rays. They're not a particularly nice bit of equipment. So the process at the moment is to remove any animals. They're routinely getting out and checked if something is entrapped in there, but there certainly is a lot of discussions going on as to whether they should be removed completely or at least during the whale migration season.
So do they try to track humpbacks in Australia, maybe using a whale tail identification system like we do here in the US? Do you try to track them and see if you're seeing the same humpbacks after year?
Yes, I believe so. There's quite a great deal of research going out of Griffith University on the Gold Coast. I believe they do track certain individuals. They are also starting to implement more and more satellite tracking, which I don't know how long-term those stay on. I'm not sure if how many whales as individuals are logged. I will confess that's beyond my realm of education, I suppose. But they do, on a population level, certainly do a census every year to track how many whales are just coming up past the coastline, which is really quite cool, which gives an idea that the whale numbers are increasing. And then there are certain individuals, of course, that do have very distinct and individual markings. There's a few whales that are kind of like a half white and half black colour, like a pied kind of colour, as well as a few white whales and some that may have particular injuries, whether they've been from boat strikes or orca attacks and things like that, certain scarring. So there are certainly a few individuals that are tracked, but I don't know if they, I don't think they're trying to track each individual as they come up past this migration.
Great, thank you. Does Lady Elliot Island have any ground predators?
I don't believe so. I think it's a fairly small island, so quite easy to manage any introduced predators. There's certainly no native mammalian predators on there, but I believe that there isn't any rats or anything on the island, certainly no foxes or cats or anything like that, which is why it's such a successful breeding area for so many different seabird species. So, yeah, as far as land-based predators, I'm pretty sure there's nothing on there.
Jacob, we've had a lot of compliments on your pictures today. Can you tell us what your primary camera and lens is?
Thank you. That's really kind. The main camera I'm using at the moment is a Nikon. I'm trying to make a complete blank. Nikon Z6 II. Every zoomed in photo I've ever taken has been on a 70 to 300 mil lens. I've never had to really go past that, which is kind of cool, because the bigger the lens, the heavier it gets. And a lot of these photos prior to this were taken on a Nikon D7200 or a D500, again with a lens with a similar kind of focal length there. So yeah, all on the Nikon for these ones. And the underwater ones, I will say, with the Australian sea lions were just on a GoPro.
Great, thank you for letting us know that. Unfortunately, that is going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to hand it back to you for any closing comments you may have for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again for joining, guys. I really appreciate you joining in and being able to learn about these animals. I would think a lot of these animals maybe you've never even heard of. You know, animals like the Australian sea lion, they're so highly unique. And I do really hope that you are able to join us at some point in Australia to come and see some of these guys in the flesh. But I also hope you enjoyed kind of learning about some of the conservation that is going on with some of these threatened species, particularly like the shy albatross, the southern right whale, and the Australian sea lion. It is really important that these guys are protected, of course. So there's some good work going out to ensure that they don't succumb to, you know, higher endangerment or, of course, extinction as well. So I hope you've really learned something today. Yeah, thanks very much for joining.
Jacob, thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Now, if you're interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We will see you next time.